Electronic
Oh, okay.
We'll go ahead and get started. I have the privilege to get to introduce Dr. Travis Mulliniks. Travis actually has a PhD at New Mexico State University, working with Dr. Mark Peterson. May surprise some of you, may not have known this, but he actually spent 2 years here at Montana State, out of Fort Keogh as a state people specialist. What, in Tennessee?
Tennessee, yeah.
Tennessee, and then at University of Nebraska, he got the Sand Hills Goodmanson Laboratory for several years. And then recently has moved on to Oregon State Associate Department Head.
Yeah.
I didn't even know they had that position.
Yep.
The Harvey endowed chair. Known Travis for a long time, so a lot of really interesting work. Nutrition.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Tim, and thanks for having me here today, and looking forward to presenting some of the stuff we've had going on the last several years in my journeys around the United States. As Tim covered, just quickly, grew up in Oklahoma on a cow-calf operation. My master's was in range nutrition at New Mexico State. My PhD was at New Mexico State, but I did my research at Miles City and also got a minor in ag economics during that time frame. I was telling Tim this morning, we were talking about cold, and when I left Las Cruces, I left on January 4th. I still remember that day. Moved to Miles City, so that's an 18-hour drive. About a 70-degree change in winter. In the first week of being there, we were taking fecal samples, and Matt Cronin knows. Matt and I were roommates actually for a while in Miles City. That first week that being there, we took fecal samples of cows. The only part of me that was warm was this one hand. And so that was a good introduction to Montana very quickly. From there, I took a job in Tennessee. And the main reason I took it was a challenge. It was a totally different environment coming from range production systems, forcing me to think different. And so I'm a big proponent of students being uncomfortable. You know, we live in a society today that we want to be in comfort. That doesn't lead to good outcomes. And so challenge yourself and getting out of your comfort zone. You learn so much. And so I spent almost 5 years in Tennessee, and that was a big time that I learned a lot because it was a totally different environment, totally different production system that I knew. And so a lot of the framework that I think today was because I got into this uncomfortable state of it's totally different than I know it, that I was raised, grew up with, and was trained in. So I took away, I never want to move east again. But I took away a lot from being in Tennessee. After that, I was on faculty at University of Nebraska for about 6 years. I had a research extension appointment. I was in the southwestern part of the state, located off campus. And then I oversaw our research facility in the Sand Hills, Goodmanson Sand Hills Laboratory. That was about 90 miles north. Really nice facility. We were in about 600 cows, about 300 yearlings. And it's one of those parts that will always stick with me because it was such a tremendous place to live and be a part of. And then since August of this last year, I accepted or moved to Oregon State for an endowed chair position and also the associate department head. So I never through this process ever thought I would be administrative. And so next week I get the pleasure of actually being the active department head for the week. But part of my role with Oregon State, I oversee all of our farms. And so from the dairy to our meat lab, equine center, sheep center, then our 2 beef ranches, part of the department. And Tim, you probably know that this is a picture of Sun Creek. tremendous forage growing potential in the summer. And so a lot of our producers on the eastern part of the state love shipping cows to Western Oregon. Going from, talking about running cows per section to running a cow per 2 acres. All right, so a foundation of what I'm talking about my research and how I think about my research program is from the production system efficiencies. And so a lot of my research when I moved to Tennessee has been focused on milk production. And so a touch on some milk production on cow type, managing cows within the environment, and mostly in this section, we talk about heifer development. And lastly, some strategic supplementation research that we've done, mostly focused on young cows. How do we get young cows rebred? And so when I moved to Tennessee and I started proposing and writing grants on milk production, the crews at the farms laughed. And they came out and watched. Anytime we milk cows, this was one of my grad students at the time in Tennessee, is you would have 10 to 15 people just standing around watching. Because it was the craziest thing of us milking beef cows. And so we got a lot of really good data on the impact of milk production on cow performance. And so over the last 10, 15 years, I've given a lot of talks on milk production. And I've pissed off a lot of producers on milk production as well. I once had a producer in Tennessee called the department head and I was telling his producers not to buy his bulls. And it was just because I talked about milk production. But when I think about milk production, I think it from a system effect, because we get in a mindset of I get producers call a lot, say, I need to increase my milk production because my weaning weight's too low. We get in this really simple thinking of one thing doesn't affect another thing, right? So every decision in ranch production has a downstream effect. If I change one thing, I change a lot of downstream effects. Milk production is one of those that can have a drastic downhill effect on the entire system. And we'll get in more of that in this presentation. One thing to note is, even as a nutritionist, reproduction is the main limiting factor for beef production systems. And it's 5 times more economically important than milk production than it is for calf growth, right? And so every decision I make, I should be looking at from the standpoint of, does it influence my reproduction? The other side of that is, so there's some really nice benchmarking data sets. And so in one of these data sets, so the 2 largest factors for profitability for a ranch, one, the largest is feed costs. And it's quite somewhere 50 to 65% of my overhead cost of my cow costs. So that's grazing, any feed I buy, etc., has a major influence on my profit. The next one is depreciation and operating costs. When I get down to calf body weight at weaning, there's only 5% influence on profitability. But we got a lot of producers that are focused on 5% rather than the 50 to 60%, right? So when I chase traits to get increased weaning weight, what am I influencing on the cost over here that has bigger influence on my profit? So this is the genetic selection for milk. I'm going to update the slide, but it looks exactly the same. So this is the genetic selection for milk across, 7 breeds. And so for the last 20 to 30 years, we have been putting a heavy focus on single trait selection for growth, 1 through milk. So we've got cows today are milking more than Holstein cow did in 1970s, 1980s. So that's a major issue in our herds, that we have cows milking much more at a higher quality of milk than Holsteins did in the 70s, 80s. But when we look at average weaning weights of commercial cow-calf operations, and this is 2 databases, and if I added Kansas database, it looks exactly the same, is a flat line. So I've got all this genetic potential for growth, whether or not it's selecting just straight growth of weaning weight, or going back to that last slide of milk production. What am I doing to weaning weight? I'm not influencing it, right? So our environments dictate that response. There's only so much nutrients in our environment to handle that much growth. But guess who wins in this equation? I'm selecting for more and more growth, and this is my output. That feeder is winning in this equation. All right, so I usually ask 2 different questions to producers. Is there a limit to milk production that your forage can support? Or is there a limit to calf milk intake for production that will support additional gains? So the second one, limit of calf milk intake, is I've had cows milk over 40 pounds at one milking. So can a calf suckle 40 pounds in a day? But I'm feeding that cow, her requirement is at 40 pounds. And that calf cannot suckle that much in a given day to actually benefit for that. The other side of that is when I'm increasing milk, that additional gain, I don't see efficiency. So the efficiency of gain as milk goes up decreases, right? So I'm pouring more and more feed in that cow for that milk. But the offside of that is I'm not getting that additional gain. This was a study that we did in Tennessee with, I think, about 300 Black Angus cows that we milked them at 3 different time points to get basically low, moderate, and high milk cows. So think of low here as a cow that milked somewhere less than 15 to 18 pounds at peak lactation. Moderate was somewhere around 22, 24, and then high was 28 plus. And so when we looked at that from a reproductive standpoint, is that these are mature cows of timed AI percentages that once I got in this high range, I started influencing reproductive response. That cows that were milking higher, even in a high quality environment as Tennessee, they were feeding these cows corn silage after calving. I still seen a response on reproduction. So there's a limit to that benefit of increasing milk. When we look at calf side of that, this is 205 days of age on calf weaning weight. So this is peak milk production by calf weaning weight. So as you see, we have this linear increase to a point about 22 pounds. And what happens after that? It declines. And so part of this, I think, is that one, you have a limit of how much that calf is actually consuming. The other part of that is over here is there's some really great historical data on milk production that was done here at Montana State by Ray and Sotogi that found that these calves on this end actually start consuming forage earlier, and they consume more forage earlier. And there may be a positive response later in life because of rumen development, because these calves are eating forage, developing their rumen earlier than a calf over here that has less requirement on that. All right, so increasing milk does not necessarily respond to increasing calf gain or calf weaning weight. When we look at final pregnancy rates in those cows, same response is these are mature cows, 75% pregnancy rate on cows that milk 25 plus of milk at peak lactation in a high quality environment. I'll take that out of, let's go to a semi-arid environment. That makes it even harder for those cows in a semi-arid environment, has less nutrients if they're a higher milking cow. And part of that response is due to this. Okay. The next slide. So one thing I did with those calves, the offspring of those calves, is I put them in a 90-day backgrounding period. And so I put them in my grow safe. I grew 90 days on forage-based diet. And so the first 30 days in the growth stage, we found offspring from the low to moderate actually have higher average daily gains than the highs. And then they had a lower feed to gate ratio, so they're more efficient. And part of this is one could be due to offspring from high milking cows have larger organs. They have higher requirements themselves. The other part of that could be due to if these cows are consuming forage earlier in life, their rumen may be developed a little better, more efficient by the time they're weaned and put in a backgrounding lot. And so that could influence some response down the line. So we had a study here when I was in Nebraska that looked at high versus low. When we were looking at grazing behavior, I have some rumen micro data as well with this. But one thing that we found in 2022 when we were in a drought scenario was, and these are mature cows in our May calving herd, is that high milk was 22 pounds. Our pregnancy rate in that year was 66%. Our low milk, less than 18 pounds, was 93%. So if I've got cows that milk a lot in my environment, they may work some years. But when I get in trouble, when I'm in a drought scenario, when they're stressed, they may not respond quite as well as cows that milk less, that have lower requirement. And we saw that through body condition score differences, body weight differences. So that high milk cow has to use those available nutrients for milk production versus for reproduction for their body. And so I carry a lot of risk in an operation when I have cows that milk more. Okay? So in arid environments, semi-arid environments that we have drought and drought often, I carry a lot of risk when I'm selecting for cows that have higher milk. And part of that reproductive response in that study and the study I did in Tennessee is partly due to this. So this is some data of mine when I was at New Mexico State. And this was with 2 and 3-year-old cows. So we have resumption of estrus. So when they started cycling again after calving by their milk production. And it's a fairly clear linear line that if a cow milks more, she's going to cycle later. And so in a feed production system, I need cows to be bred roughly 80, 85 days after calving to maintain that calving interval. Once I'm out here over 16 pounds of milk, these cows are cycling 100, 120 days out. They're not going to maintain a yearly calving interval. Even if they got bred in this year, her year next year, she's going to calve late, which may cause her to be open following that. So you carry a lot of risk and potential negative impact on reproduction when I start increasing milk. So increasing milk increases risk of a production system. So you're willing to take more risk for whatever additional gain you possibly could get with increasing milk. So we may have minimal increase in calf growth. There's potential for no increase in calf growth. Our feed resources may limit expression of milk. So we really need to play within the environment and the nutrients that we have in our environments. Our production system, totally, we may see decreased reproductive efficiency, may have some decreased post-weaning calf efficiency, but we'll see some production cost increase. And so just because I can increase milk, and just because it may increase weaning weight, we may have some downstream effect on the entire production system. When I was at Nebraska, one of the #1 calls I would get from producers is that my cows in the last 10 years are thinner, they're cycling later, my pregnancy rates are getting lower, and my calving interval is wider. And guess why that was happening? They started increasing cow size, they started increasing milk production, and they decreased their entire production system efficiency by chasing a weaning weight. So it's really important to bring it back to the context of your production system and the nutrients that you have. Moved over to some strategic supplementation research. And so Tim probably has quite a few of these as well, but had quite a few of these electronic feeders when I was in Nebraska. We used through C-Lock, but a lot of my supplementation work is focused on targeting metabolic response. I wanted to feed something in a small package that could have a big impact. So it wasn't feeding necessarily a amount of something, but could I feed a small amount of something that could have the same performance, same impact in feeding a larger gross amount? So we've got a lot of challenges in, especially young females in production systems on rangeland-based systems. And so one, they go into negative energy balance, and this cow is one of my favorite pictures of cows that was in one of my studies. And so this was in New Mexico. She calved, she's fully in body conditions for less than a 4. She's consuming some really low quality forages. Green up won't occur for the next couple of months in New Mexico. And I'm expecting her to support that calf, recover from calving, start cycling, and get pregnant. That is a very tough system. And so they go through this negative energy balance. They have to partition nutrients to support lactation. So when she consumes that energy, she has to support lactation before she's going to support reproduction or body weight gain. And so that's a very tough condition for those cows. And a lot of times we will run into instances those cows become diabetics. So they become insulin resistant. And that has a big negative impact on reproduction. The other challenge in a lot of our forage-based systems is rumen fermentation of those forages provides inadequate supply of propionate. So if you think about our big supply of BFAs coming from the rumen is going to be acetate, propionate, butyrate. So acetate will be your energy source. Propionate will be, for a cow, will be your glucose source. So unlike us, after we eat, we'll have a spike in glucose. Cow will never have a spike in glucose because the rumen microbes utilize 98% of that glucose. So a cow has to make all of its glucose from either propionate or amino acids later on to supply the need of propionate. Well, during early lactation, the need for glucose goes from a very little to about 2 pounds of about 2 pounds of sugar is needed to support lactation. So we've got a huge demand of need for glucose after lactation. So I've got an inadequate supply of glucose, which causes cows to be insulin resistant. So they don't oxidize acetate for energy. It starts building up and then becomes ketotic. Same as the dairy cow. So for young cows in early lactation, they often become insulin resistant. They've got to make their own glucose, and that primarily comes from propionate, which is in short supply, or it comes from protein sources. So a lot of my research has been focused on this area here of how can I increase propionate supply to that young lactating cow. And so in the dairy side, they actually talk about glucose as actually a requirement in their systems. In the beef side, it's ignored. And so there is actually I believe there's actually a glucose requirement that we're missing that can have a negative impact on production efficiency. So this was a study I did during my master's of feeding 3 different supplements that increased glycogenic supply to that cow. As glucose supply increased from a rumen degradable source, rumen undegradable, and then a rumen undegradable plus 40 grams of a propionate supply, we increased pregnancy rates in 2- and 3-year-old cows. This is one of my favorite studies that was done in Great Britain that fed lambs they fed lambs oat chaff. And so oat chaff is extremely low quality feed stuff. And so they fed on either 0% fish meal, which is a rumen undegradable protein source, or 6% fish meal in their diet, or they infused them with 0 grams per day of glucose or 80 grams a day of glucose. When they combined the fish meal, the bypass protein source, with glucose, they had a feed conversion ratio of 4.2. That's extremely efficient with something extremely low quality. If I'm in a feedlot and I'm getting a feed conversion ratio of 4, I'm doing really good. If I'm eating something this low quality and getting a feed conversion ratio of 4, I'm doing excellent. So that's combining two nutrients that's really needed to oxidize and utilize energy very effectively. So another study, what we did with a rumen degradable source, a rumen undegradable source, and a rumen undegradable plus propionate salts, also found that young cows, if we increase that glucogenic supply, young cows started cycling earlier. So the number one thing that keeps young cows from getting pregnant is when they start cycling. That postpartum interval, it drives production efficiency for a young female that we need those cows cycling earlier to get pregnant early enough, and the following year can stay in the herd. So a lot of what my research is focused on is what I consider metabolic flexibility. And it's talked about a lot on the human side, but how can I have cows that can lose body weight, go through these high demand times, but be very efficient in mobilizing and utilizing the energy sources that they have? So this is a group of cows that we have that I've got NEFA, so their fat loss that they're mobilizing. Today's the first estrus. And so cows that mobilized high amount of NEFA, so body weight, that could oxidize it, cycled earlier than cows that were not oxidizing or mobilizing body tissue. So the orange here is ketone bodies. And so if they're oxidizing that NEFA and utilizing that NEFA, ketones are not building up. And so they're utilizing it as energy. So they're very effective of losing body weight, oxidizing it, using it for energy, and cycling much quicker. Cows that don't have that aspect, their NEFAs are lower and their ketones are higher. So they don't oxidize and utilize their body reserves very effectively. So efficient cows have the ability to oxidize and mobilize and oxidize their body reserves to get pregnant, start cycling and get pregnant. And part of that is, and this is done a lot on the dairy side, is that we can use actually their ketone concentrations prior to breeding season to predict when they're going to get pregnant. And so cows that have low ketones, using a ketone meter, low ketones prior to breeding season have a lower ketone concentration than cows that have high ketones. So that ketone, as it's rising, as it higher, actually has a negative impact on insulin resistance and their ability to cycle and get pregnant. So a lot of our research has been focused around that of, can I supply more glucose post-ruminally? And so we did a 3-year study in Nebraska that compared 2 different sources that could supply post-ruminal propionate supply. One is rumensin. So rumensin is utilized a lot in the feedlot, in the backgrouting lot. It's utilized quite a bit, a lot of cow production systems from a feed efficiency side, but it also increases propionate supply by changing rumen fermentation. And so we compared feeding rumensin to the product calcium propionate. So an indirect source of increasing propionate to a direct source of propionate. In March calving 2 and 3-year-old cows that we fed 2 pounds per day from calving to breeding. So the only thing different in these supplements was changing from 180 milligrams of Mulliniks to 40 grams of calcium propionate. We look at cow body weight, no difference in cow body weight by supplement type. We look at ketone bodies, and so how well are they utilizing their energy? Ketone bodies were lower by feeding calcium propionate versus rumensin. So there was more glucose available to oxidize and utilize their energy, which decrease the available ketones circulating in the blood. When we look at pregnancy rates between the two, Rumensin's pregnancy rate was at 80%. Calcium propionate was at 89%. Small changes in diets can have a massive impact on reproductive performance. It's not that I have to feed more or something, but small changes targeted at metabolic processes can really have big impacts on getting cows to be more productive in our systems. The next study that we did off that set cows was, can I increase glycogenic supply comparing that calcium propionate by increasing that supply through increasing rumen undergradable protein supply. And so this is a 3-year study that I had compared 4 different supplements. So straight distillers with 40 grams of calcium propionate. And then from there we changed, increasing, so these had the same amount of rumen undergradable supply. The glycogenic potential of the diet increased by adding calcium propionate. I kept glycogenic potential of the diet the same, but just changed diet of increasing where that's coming from a direct propionate source or by utilizing rumen or a rumen undergradable protein source of blood milk, and then doubled that and increased it again with blood milk again. So can I influence that response by just changing the amount of rumen undergradable supply to those cows? Not a huge difference in body weight change or body weight gain between the 3. But when we look at pregnancy rates, distillers was at 72%. Just adding 40 grams of calcium propionate went up to 90. Little change in diet made a huge impact. Then the blood milk addition, 96, and increasing it again was at 95. So there's a certain point where it's less effective. But those small changes can have those big impacts without a big change in my cost. So a big thing that was going on in Nebraska, and I think Tim's alluded to it's going on here in Montana, is we've went from a lot of spring calving herds to summer calving herds. And it was primarily to do with getting out of blizzards. When I was in Nebraska, we would get a lot of April, early May blizzards. And the hardest animal to deal with it is a 30-day-old calf when that blizzard hits. So we would have a lot of producers that would have huge calf death loss because of blizzard. So they started moving out of spring calving into summer calving. Summer calving has a lot of challenges. And so in our summer calving herds, we would turn bulls out in August, 1st of August. By July 1, our forage quality looked similar to a winter range scenario. So we're breeding on very low quality forages. And so we've got cows that are in really great condition that may be in body condition 5 or 6 that are losing body weight by the time breeding hits and through the breeding cycle. We also have a protein, not just a protein deficiency, we have a metabolizable protein deficiency. Don't have a rumen degradable deficiency during that time frame, but we have a metabolizable protein deficiency. And then we have an imbalance of VFAs, of forage quality. So it's a very tough time, especially for a young female. And so this graph here is pregnancy rates from our May calving 2 and 3-year-old cows from 2012 to 2017. And so this is comparing March versus May's in overall preg rates. And so it wasn't uncommon, and when I got there, it wasn't uncommon to have a 50% pregnancy rate in May calving 2s and 3-year-olds. If you think about profitability, you're not very profitable if you're losing at that rate. And so when we turned bulls out to 1st of August, we're already in this net energy balance of cows losing body weight. We look at protein balance or protein supply. Rumen degradable protein was above what the requirement was. But by the time we start turning bulls out in August, we start getting deficient in metabolizable protein. So in this scenario, if I came in with alfalfa hay, I'm really not helping myself out because all I'm doing is increasing rumen degradable and not necessarily increasing metabolized protein supply. And so protein type is very important in this scenario. And so I designed a study to around that and around the fact that most of our herds during those summer calving scenarios they're breeding in pastures that are farthest away from headquarters. They're hard to get to. They're hard to feed. And so I designed this study around that concept of it's hard to feed them, but we have these deficiencies. And so my negative control was just mineral. My next supplement was 4 ounces of mineral plus rumensin. I will have to say, this is not fed to label. And so this is probably one of the top questions I got as an extension specialist is I'm putting rumensin in my mineral, is it going to have impact? What impact does rumensin have in my mineral? And so from a university standpoint, we don't have that answer. But we also, technically, because it's not fed to label, we can't recommend feeding that. The other one is 4 ounces of this mineral plus 8 ounces of a high rumen undegradable source. So historically, we always called this supplement a small supplement. So it's a self-fed supplement we mixed with our mineral, fed it out to cows. It had really good results comparing that to hand feeding, let's say 2 pounds of a cottonseed milk cake. And our positive control is feeding 2 pounds per day of distillers. So we look at body weight of those cows, no difference in body weight across those time frames by supplement. We look at body weight change though, no different overall in significance, but we run into those issues that young females are losing body weight very rapidly as breeding starts. And so it wasn't uncommon and I have a lot of producers that would turn out their cows are body condition score 6 or 7 when breeding hit and lose so much body weight, they'd have pregnancy rates in the 50s. And so over-conditioned, even in a really good body condition score, that because of body weight loss issues, they would have pregnancy rate issues. When we look at AI conception rate between the 3 or 4 supplements, 50% for the mineral, 44% with the rumensin added, then 52 and 55% with the protein supplements. Overall pregnancy rates, no difference when we fed those 2 protein supplements in 84 and 86. The big benefit here is I can feed a supplement once a week in a self-fed scenario and have the same response as feeding 2 pounds per day of distillers. With distillers, I've got to feed it at least every other day to get this benefit. And so I've got a labor efficiency there. I've got a cost efficiency and just a resource efficiency if I can feed a supplement once a week and have the same performance. The last thing I want to touch on a little bit is managing cows within the environment. And so this was some data that I took from Fort Keogh when I was a grad student there of looking at retention rate of cows. So a big focus is of heifer development is how long will they stay in your herd? Because when I develop a heifer, when I buy a heifer, she's got to pay that off at some point. And if retention rate's not there, someone has to pay for that heifer. So retention rate is a big influence on profitability. And the largest challenge we have in how long they'll stay in the herd is in this time frame right here, my 2s or my 3s. And so that's really important. And what we just covered is that if you pay attention to this time frame, you can really influence longevity and retention rate. So this was a study that a previous PhD student I did in Tennessee. And so what we compared, and these treatments here don't really matter too much, is the low input systems here versus a dry lot system. And so this is the payback period. How many years did it take for that heifer to pay herself off until she was actually profitable and making money? And so in our low input systems, it took anywhere from 3.5 years to 3.7 years before she started paying herself off. In a dry lot system that I was developing heifers to 65% of their mature body weight time breeding, nearly 10 years. And so how many heifers do I have that make it to 10 years of age to pay themselves off? Very few, right? And so how I manage and how I develop my heifers is crucial in that long-term profitability because of payback. This was a study that was done during my PhD at New Mexico State that compared low and pit range scenario versus a feedlot scenario, developing heifers for 100 days. Right, so heifers came from the same herd, same genetics. We just took the range heifers, half of them went to a dry lot, half of them stayed on the native range. And so expected gain during this 100-day period was about 3/4 pound per day here in the range group in blue, or 1.5 pounds per day gain in the dry lot group. So at breeding, they all came back together. There's roughly 100-pound difference here at start of breeding. And then at New Mexico, we get monsoonal rain starting in May, June. We'll see the range heifers catch up, really start have that compensatory gain period and really catch up by the time we get to breeding or by the time we project. When we look at longevity of those, of range versus feedlot, this is pregnancy rates after that first as a yearling. 94 in our range, 84% in the feedlot group. But really what's important is this. By the time they were 5 years of age, I've got 68% of my heifers that will develop on range, still in the herd. I've got 42% of my heifers that went to a feedlot for 100 days that did not get pregnant, did not make it in the herd that long. That's a big impact on profitability. So how I develop my heifers, even for a short time point, right? 100 days is not very long. That 100 days really changed their lifetime productivity. By taking them out of that system and feeding them a treatment or feeding a nutrient level that's going to be much higher than they're ever going to see again. So that really influenced them long term. A study that we just wrapped up here in the last couple of weeks was with our May calving heifers. And so I showed you that data earlier that we had a lot of issues with breedback in young May cows. And so one thing I did was I started converting each year. I started converting some springboard heifers into my May herd. And so one, I wanted to see, well, they're older, are they more mature? The other deal is they come out of much better system. There's a lot more nutrients in that spring calving herd than there is in a May calving herd. So are they going to be adapted to that May calving system to withstand that different in environment? And so this was a 3-year study of developing heifers that way, and then I followed them out for 5 years of age, looking at reproduction and calf performance. And so this picture is a picture of this is a March calving calf, heifer at the time with the yellow tag, and a May calving heifer standing behind it. And so we had roughly 273 heifers across those 3 years get developed. And so if you look at what we call converts, you look at the converts, their day of calving in a year was roughly on average 73 days. Our early Mays, so I broke these out of the first 21 days of calving, I called it an early May calving heifer. Anything that calved after the first 21 days, I called it a late May calving heifer. So they averaged 155 by 132. Look at body weight. Converts were always slightly heavier across that, just older, bigger, had more time to grow by time these dates occurred. When we look at longevity, retention rate out to 5 years of age, the heifers that I converted into our May herd, 60% were left versus 46 and 41. Same genetics. That actually May herd came out of our March herd about 6, 7, 8 years before this started. Very similar genetics. Same bulls were used across both herds. When we look at how I developed or that age difference, by bringing in those genetics that were older, gave that heifer more opportunity to develop, grow, get pregnant, and retain in that system. So that's really, long term, how I'm selecting my heifers and how I manage my heifers can have a major impact. So it's not only selecting early calving heifers within that system, but if I was a May herd, I would be looking at buying heifers out of a very similar March calving herd that fits mine to be my source of replacement heifers. Is this, from a long-term standpoint, this has a big impact. When I look at pounds of calf weaned per those systems, the converts weaned on total 169 pounds of calf per cow, per heifer, versus 624 versus 631. So it's not only the longevity standpoint is, they're just weaning so much more on a heavier calf. On average, that convert cow was weaning slightly heavier calf each year than the other two. So we'll wrap this up really quickly on some technology that we're using that can really help, I think, production systems. And so I don't know if Tim's had pushback here in Montana with technology, but we got a lot of pushback. And so, but you think what technology is eyes that you don't have eyes. We manage cows in environments that we don't often see cows. So I had producers that they wouldn't see their cows maybe once a year. And it's hard to manage cows that you cannot see. Technology provides that resource, having those eyes where you can't see, have someone or see what's going on. And so we've used this is Vets, a virtual fence system. We've used a lot of the C-Lock system as well. But one thing I just want to highlight to wrap this up is, so when we hired a precision livestock specialist about 4 years ago, when the day she started, I emailed her. I said, I want to use cameras. And I don't have any clue how this works, but I want to use cameras. And so can we use cameras to estimate cow body weight? Because anytime I get a call from a producer to do a ration, I ask, what's the size of cow you have? And they always tell me 1,100 pounds. Well, that ration is fit for a 1,300 pound cow when I get done. Because one, they have no clue how big their cows are. The other part of that is we are really reactive managers. And so in 2017, we had what they call a bomb cyclone come through in March. And so we had extremely cold, extremely wet. And so we had cows lose a full body condition score in less than 30 days because it was so cold and so wet. And guys did not have a clue. They were so reactive that they were behind the ball. They had down our cow issues. They had breedback issues because they didn't have the equipment or the tools to make that decision early enough that my cows were losing body weight too fast, that I need to make changes. And so for the last 3-4 years, we've been working on using cameras in production system to estimate body weights of cows and yearling heifers. And the idea behind this is that I can have cameras set up at a water source that cows come in at frequently. It takes a picture, and through AI and artificial learning, it can send you back to, let's say, an interface that can just tell you if you have flags that cows should not lose more than so many pounds per day. And it starts flagging cows, right? There's other options with this of, if I lost a calf to a sickness, I lost a lot of money. And cameras have the ability to early detect sickness as well. So there's a lot of ability down the road with using cameras to actually give you data where you can't be, but also predicts stuff that's going on. And so our approach, and this is video of our approach, how we validated this, is we just had a camera set up above our alley as we were working cows. And so just took the video of it and took those body weights of those cows and estimated, and it's over my head, but basically be able to estimate what was the body weight of that cow running through that chute compared to their chute score. And so this was a paper we recently published in Translational Animal Scientists that estimated body weight of cows compared to their scale measured weight of a predictive of 0.92. It's a very, very high predictive rate of estimating cows' body weight. And so you think about in production systems that, for a long time, from a cow-calf side of this is we lacked a lot of technology. We have a lot of technology we have not adopted that has a great benefit of implants of AI, et cetera. But versus other segments of the dairy or the cropping, they've really utilized technologies to boost performance, boost production efficiencies. And this is one of, I think, can have a really big impact on the ability of a producer to be proactive. They can have these interfaces that flags cows of, you've got a sickness. You got cows losing too much body weight. You've got cows, not gaining, yearlings not gaining what you need them to gain. Really to help fine tune management decisions to make them better managers. So in conclusion, we have a tendency to overdo things. And so I always get a kick out of a producer that says that cow's a good milker and put a lot of emphasis on milk production. And I had a technician on one of our research facilities that said that in a cow, and we milked her right after that. She did not milk. And so there's a lot of things we just don't know, but we have these preconceived ideas that more is sometimes better. But it's a balancing act of our production systems and our risk. We can be very strategic with supplements. We don't have to feed gross amounts to have a big impact. And so I'm big on feeding bypass protein sources. I'm big on increasing glucogenic supply. My grad students once had a joke that every answer for me will always be glucose. But increasing that glucose supply to young cows can have a big impact on reproductive performance. Heifer selection and development impacts longevity and lifetime productivity. You have to be very careful with how we develop and select our heifers. The technology may provide opportunity to mitigate challenges within range production systems. I just think of it as eyes and people out in the field that we don't have the ability to get there. Provide us data that we never had before. Because we manage in situations that it's hard to get data, even from a research standpoint. And so we had better data in the 1980s of feed intake than we do today, Tim. And so it's really hard to get good data. And technology, I think, really benefits a lot of the gaps that we have in production systems. So with that, gladly take any questions.
Travis, real quick, I got a meeting here at 1, but phenomenal presentation. Learned a lot. We're seeing similar issues in the commercial sheep industry. We have that added benefit or hindrance of having multiple lambs. Producers can select for high lamb drop too. I've got a lot of commercial producers that are telling me their actual pounds of lamb wean per ewe exposed has been going down over the last 10 years. So we've kind of been digging into that. But one of the questions we've had, and I think your early stuff kind of worked around it a little bit, is so you're not seeing an increase in calf weight, but the genetic potential for milk is going up. You would think it would transfer to calf weight. Are we just basically breeding cows to eat more, like they did in the dairy industry? Because that's kind of what we think in the sheep industry is going on.
Yeah, I think we have, because we're still breeding. We have the genetic potential or requirements for that, right? So if you look at yearling weight EPD, we look at weaning weight EPD, they've done the same thing, right? And those are going to be just as big drivers at intake as milk production will be. And so we have a great capacity to eat. So, and even in Nebraska, I could take one of my heifers and put her in a dry lot pen, and I could get her to 2,000 pounds of a cow, easy. Or I could keep her on range and she would be a 1,000 pound or 1,000 pound cow. But we have cows with capacity, a large capacity to eat. And so for guys that are selling at weaning, they're losing all that genetic potential because that feedlot guy is capturing all that growth. Because it's stored up in that animal. It just hasn't been able to express it because of limited nutrients. And so, but I do think we're increasing dry matter and or the ability to eat dry matter intake on the whole through that.
Thank you for your talk. I'm really interested in your milk production as it relates to weaning weight, but my question is more around the insulin resistance piece of things in your negative energy balance.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of opposite of what we know to be true in all species, where if we actually go into a negative energy balance and increase ketogenesis, we actually increase insulin sensitivity. So I'm curious if you have done any glucose kinetics or insulin sensitivity measures to determine that. So I think that could blow the lid off of what we know to be true.
We've done so many glucose tolerance tests, acetate tolerance tests. Yes, that increasing glucose supply increases acetate clearance rate, increases or decreases glucose clearance rate as well. And so
that would be improved insulin sensitivity.
So we do have improved. So when I increase ketone supply, when ketones are higher, you actually have a negative feedback on GLUT4. It actually, it goes up to the membrane, but what happens is you don't get that glucose into the tissue. And so with high ketones, it actually has a negative feedback on the GLUT4 receptor. So yeah, we've done so many glucose tolerance tests.
Yeah.
The last 20 years that, yeah.
I'd be interested to see if that's just because there's not as much glucose available
It is.
moving across their transporters, more so than the insulin sensitivity.
It may be,
Yeah.
but glucose is such a short supply in those animals,
Right.
right? And so that's really what's driving it, is glucose is such a short supply.
Thank you.
But so a lot of my glucose tolerance stuff actually mimics a highly insulin resistant dairy cow.
Mhm.
I mean, it looks exactly the same as a highly resistant dairy cow.
I'd like to ask on the pregnancy retention, are you calling, I have two questions. Are you calling open cows, and what is your confidence on that recommendation if you are? And then secondly, if I go out and buying bulls, what is your optimal EPDs for the various, particularly size?
Yeah. So on the retention rate, if a cow didn't get pregnant or did not wean a calf, she's out of that database.
What is your confidence in that?
100%. Because I know if she did not, if she was not pregnant, you know, so using ultrasound, et cetera, then she was not pregnant. And so or if she did not wean a calf the following year.
After, when we're all done, I'd like that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about, optimal EPDs? I just went to wholesale yesterday.
Yeah.
And you got the range from.
Yeah. So EPDs that's a very long answer. Because your system's going to be different than your neighbor of what you need, right? But moderation is important for the cow. The other thing that we'll stress is from a production system, the most underutilized thing we have today is terminal sires. Outside of implants, et cetera, is terminal sires. So if I was a beef producer that had less than 300 cows, I am a terminal system. So I do not want to have her on the place. Everything is terminal. And so you give up so many pounds by being just maternal versus terminal. So I've used terminal bulls that increase my weaning weight by 100 pounds. And so for a lot of producers, that is one of the things that they give up a lot, is because the benefits of a terminal herd and thinking they have to develop their own heifers. Now, except from the milk side, I can talk about it. From the other side, it's really up to the producer based on their goals. For milk, you know, so milk EPD is the only EPD that actually is not measured. So it is the maternal ability associated with weaning weight. It's not necessarily milk. So there's a little struggle with that. There's some early data in the 1990s so show there's a high correlation between the two. But if I increase my milk EPD, I'm increasing milk overall anyways. And so from a range situation, I don't like my milk EPD over 22. So I want anything 22 or below on milk EPD.
Think in the Great Basin.
I would be lower than that, yeah. I would be lower than that in the Great Basin, yeah.
Great, thanks, Travis, again. Grad students, lunch will be down the hall, if you're sitting around for that.